The air in the community clubhouse meeting room was thick, with the scent of stale coffee and self-importance. Grant Reed sat at a long folding table, his back straight, his hands resting calmly on a manila folder. It was Monday, October the 2nd, the first Architectural Control Committee ACC meeting of the month, and he was item number 3 on the agenda: application for dock maintenance. 128 Shoreline Drive. A simple request, a formality, or so he had thought. Across the table, Lydia Hart, president of the Lakeside Estates Homeowners Association, peered at him over the top of her half-moon glasses. Her smile was a bright, brittle thing, a carefully constructed pleasantry that did not reach her eyes. She tapped a perfectly manicured finger on his application. "Mr. Reed," she began, her voice smooth and polished, projecting to the dozen or so neighbors seated in the gallery behind him. "Thank you for your submission. The committee has reviewed your request to restain your structure." She used the word structure as if it were a particularly unpleasant insect. Grant kept his own tone level and polite. "It's a dock, Lydia. And it's the same semi-transparent cedar stain I've used every 4 years since my father built it. The color is on the pre-approved palette. Natural redwood. Code 7B. He had done his homework. He always did." Lydia's smile tightened by a millimeter. "Yes, we are aware of the historical precedent. However, the board has been developing a new, comprehensive community waterfront harmonization plan. We feel it's time to move toward a more unified and, frankly, upscale aesthetic for the properties bordering the lake." A murmur went through the small crowd. Harmonization plan. It sounded official, important. It was also the first Grant or anyone else had heard of it. The plan aims to create a cohesive visual experience from the common area walking paths. Lydia continued, gesturing vaguely toward the windows that overlooked the manicured lawns. "Your dock, with its rustic charm, is somewhat out of step with the direction we're headed. It presents a more weathered, natural look, while we are encouraging a cleaner, more contemporary composite material in shades of gray and beige." Grant felt a slow, cold knot form in his stomach. This wasn't about stain color. "Lydia, my dock is made of cedar. I can't stain wood to look like gray composite decking. The request is simply to apply a protective sealant in an approved color to prevent rot. And we appreciate your diligence in maintaining your property," she said, the condescension dripping from every syllable. "But the ACC must consider the overall impact. Allowing your dock to remain in its current state could set a precedent that undermines the entire harmonization plan before it's even officially ratified." She was denying his request to perform basic, necessary maintenance based on a phantom plan that didn't exist in any of the governing documents he had spent the weekend rereading. He was being publicly stonewalled. He opened his folder. According to the CC&Rs, Article 6, Section 3, the ACC's purview is limited to approving materials and colors from the established guidelines. There is no provision that allows the committee to mandate a change in the core construction material of an existing, grandfathered structure. He had her. It was right there in black and white, the rule book she purported to live by. Lydia didn't even flinch. She simply turned her gaze from Grant to the audience. "What Mr. Reed is referring to are the old guidelines. The board is empowered by the bylaws to interpret and adapt these rules to protect and enhance the property values of all residents." She let the last 2 words hang in the air. A subtle pivot that painted Grant as a selfish individual, standing in the way of collective prosperity. A hodgepodge of docks, in varying states of repair and mismatched styles, does not send a message of a premium. Well-managed community. I'm sure you all can appreciate the importance of that. Heads nodded. He could feel the tide of the room turning against him. Lydia was a master of this, framing every power grab as a benevolent act for the greater good. She was turning his beautiful, hand-built cedar dock, his father's dock, into a symbol of neighborhood decay. She turned back to him, her expression now one of feigned sympathy. Therefore, the committee must deny your application at this time. We would, however, be happy to review a new application for a full replacement of the dock with an approved composite material. We can even provide you with a list of our preferred vendors. The humiliation was a physical heat on his neck. She hadn't just denied him. She had publicly instructed him to tear down his father's work and spend $20,000 on a plastic replacement, all under the guise of an imaginary plan. He had followed the rules to the letter, and she had simply invented new ones on the spot. He slowly closed his folder, the soft click of the clasp echoing in the silent room. He met her gaze, his face a neutral mask, betraying none of the cold fury coiling inside him. "Thank you for your time," he said, his voice steady. He stood, gave a polite nod to the committee, and walked out of the room, the weight of a dozen pairs of eyes on his back. He didn't know it then, but the denial of a can of wood stain was not the end of a conversation. It was the opening shot in a war. The dock was more than just wood and nails. It was Grant's sanctuary, a tangible link to his father, David Reed. He could still remember the summer of '82, a skinny 10-year-old boy handing his dad hammers and fetching lemonade as the structure took shape. David, a civil engineer with a poet's soul, had called the lake his great, quiet truth. He taught Grant how to read the subtle ripples on the water's surface, how to identify the calls of the loons at dusk, and how to cast a line, not just to catch a fish, but to find a sense of peace that the hurried world could not touch. When his father passed away 5 years ago, Grant and his wife, Clara, had moved into the house. He left his job with the Federal Fish and Wildlife Service for a quieter role as a regional conservation consultant. It allowed him to work from home, to be present for their 2 young children, and to keep watch over his father's lake. The property was his inheritance, but the lake felt like a sacred trust. He managed it as a miniature nature preserve, maintaining the delicate balance of the ecosystem, a living tribute to the man who had taught him to cherish it. This expertise, however, made him a unique threat to Lydia Hart's vision of a manicured, sterile version of suburbia, where Grant saw a vital wetland habitat for nesting birds. Lydia saw overgrown reeds that needed to be cleared, where he saw a fallen log providing cover for juvenile bass. She saw unsightly debris. After the ACC meeting, Grant's first call was to his younger sister, Sarah. She was a corporate lawyer in the city, sharp, pragmatic, and the one person who understood the emotional significance of that dock. She denied it. Sarah's voice crackled with indignation over the phone. On what grounds? The Community Waterfront Harmonization Plan. That sounds like something she invented during her drive over. That's because she did, Grant said, pacing his study, the offending application sitting on his desk. She wants me to tear it down. Sarah, tear down Dad's dock and replace it with plastic. Okay. Deep breaths. Big brother, Sarah said, her tone shifting from familial outrage to professional counsel. This is what people like Lydia do. They use vague, official-sounding language to intimidate. They create a problem, and then they graciously offer to sell you the expensive solution. Don't get angry. Get organized. Pull the original plat map for the property and a copy of the deed. Find the full, recorded set of CC&Rs and bylaws from the county, not the summary version on the HOA website. We need to establish a baseline of facts. Grant's heart rate began to slow. Sarah had a way of cutting through the emotional fog and laying out a clear path. What am I looking for? You're looking for the legal definition of your lot versus the common area. Specifically, you need to find out if the HOA has any recorded easement that gives them regulatory control over the surface of the lake or the lakebed adjoining your property. My guess is they don't. There was a pause. You know, this feels personal. Grant, it's not just about the dock. He knew she was right. The animosity between the Harts and the Reeds was a quiet, foundational story in Lakeside Estates. Decades ago, before the HOA even existed, Lydia's father, a property developer named Franklin Hart, had tried to buy up the entire parcel of land that included the lake. He had a grand vision for a dense cluster of townhomes and a commercial marina. David Reed, then a young engineer with a passion for conservation, had organized a small group of local residents to oppose the rezoning. He argued passionately at town meetings, presenting environmental impact studies and demonstrating how Hart's plan would destroy the natural watershed. In the end, David Reed and his cohort didn't just win, they outmaneuvered Franklin Hart completely. They pooled their resources and purchased the largest lakefront parcel themselves, subdividing it into spacious lots with strict conservation covenants. David built his house on the prime spot. It was a legendary local victory for environmental preservation over unchecked development. But for the Hart family, it was a humiliating public defeat and a significant financial loss. Lydia had inherited her father's ambition, and, it seemed, his grudge. Grant found himself looking at an old photograph on his bookshelf. It was his father and a much younger Lydia Hart, standing on opposite sides of a podium at a town hall meeting. His father looked calm and resolute. Lydia, a teenager then, stood behind her own father, her expression a stormy mix of anger and resentment. She was watching Grant's father as if he had stolen her future. "She's finishing her father's fight," Grant said quietly into the phone. "Exactly," Sarah replied. "And she's using the HOA as her army, which means you can't treat this like a disagreement between neighbors. This is a legal campaign. From this moment on, you document everything, every email, every conversation, every letter. Create a timeline. We fight her with her own weapons procedure and paperwork. Don't give her an inch." Later that evening, Grant stood on the dock as the sun set, the water turning to liquid gold. He ran his hand over the familiar, weathered grain of the cedar railing his father had planed by hand. This wasn't just a dispute over property. It was a battle for memory, for legacy. Lydia Hart didn't just want a gray composite dock. She wanted to erase David Reed's victory, to pave over his sanctuary and call it progress. And Grant, standing where his father had stood, knew he would not let that happen. The following week was deceptively quiet. Grant held off on restaining the dock, adhering to the ACC's verbal denial, while he and Sarah began assembling their file. He half expected a gloating email from Lydia, or a passive-aggressive note in the community newsletter. But there was nothing. The silence was unnerving, like the stillness in the air before a storm. The storm broke on Tuesday, October 10th. It didn't arrive with a thunderclap, but with the soft rustle of an envelope being pushed through his mail slot. It wasn't just any envelope. It was a crisp, white business-sized one with a green striped border that screamed certified mail. A signature was required. Clara signed for it while Grant was on a conference call, leaving it on the corner of his desk. He stared at the return address, Lakeside Estates HOA, CO Summit Property Management, 1400 Corporate Drive, Suite 200. His hand was steady as he used a letter opener to slice it open. Inside was a single, professionally printed page with the HOA logo at the top. The heading was in a bold, severe font, courtesy notice of violation. His eyes scanned the text. The formal, impersonal language, a stark contrast to the aggressive nature of the message. Dear Mr. Grant Reed, this letter serves as a courtesy notice regarding a violation of the covenants, conditions, and restrictions (CC&Rs) for the Lakeside Estates community at your property, 128 Shoreline Drive. An inspection conducted on October 9, 2023 by the Architectural Control Committee (ACC) has identified an unapproved structure on your property. Specifically, various items, including a large tackle box, a portable chair, and other fishing-related paraphernalia have been placed upon the dock, which is visible from a designated common area, the lakeside walking path. This constitutes a violation of CC&R 8.4.2, which states, all structures visible from common areas must maintain an aesthetic harmony consistent with the overall community design standards as determined by the ACC. As per the Association's enforcement policy, you are hereby requested to remedy this violation by removing the aforementioned items within 14 days from the date of this notice. Failure to comply by October 24, 2023, will result in the issuance of a formal violation notice, which may include monetary fines. We appreciate your cooperation in maintaining the aesthetic standards that make Lakeside Estates a desirable community for all residents. Sincerely, the Lakeside Estates HOA Board of Directors. Grant read the letter 3 times. His mind reeled, not from the content, but from the insidious brilliance of the strategy. She couldn't force him to tear down the dock. Not yet. So she was pivoting. She was redefining his private property as something subject to her aesthetic whims by citing its visibility from a common area. The tackle box was a gift from his children for Father's Day. The chair was where he sat with his son, teaching him to bait a hook. Lydia was calling his family's simple, harmless pastimes a violation. She was weaponizing the vaguest phrase in the entire document, aesthetic harmony, and she was using the property management company as her instrument, lending the threat a veneer of corporate, third-party legitimacy. This wasn't a note from a neighbor. It was a formal, documented legal threat. He methodically folded the violation notice, making the creases perfectly sharp. He placed it on the corner of his desk, aligning it with the edge. It was a small, useless act of control in a situation that was spiraling out of it. This was no longer a disagreement. The courtesy notice, delivered by certified mail, was the first official move on a legal chessboard. It was a documented, dated threat. It was the inciting incident, the point of no return. Lydia Hart had formalized her attack. The paper trail had begun. Grant picked up his phone and sent a photo of the letter to Sarah. Her reply came back in less than a minute. And so it begins. Don't reply to them yet. We reply on our own terms. Pull the plat map. Now. Following Sarah's advice, Grant spent the next 2 days trying to resolve the issue through the proper channels, determined to prove he was the reasonable party. His first step was to contact the property management company directly. He dialed the number for Summit Property Management and navigated a frustrating phone tree until he finally reached a portfolio manager named Brenda. He politely explained the situation, referencing the notice and CC&R 8.4.2. I believe there's been a misunderstanding, Grant said, his tone calm and professional. The dock is part of my private lot, not a common area. While it may be visible from the walking path, the items in question are personal property located on my own land. The CC&R you cited is being misapplied here. Brenda's response was a masterclass in bureaucratic deflection. I understand your position, Mr. Reed, she said, her voice devoid of any actual understanding. However, our role at Summit is to enforce the policies as directed by the Board of Directors. The Board, and specifically the ACC, has determined that the items on your dock are not in keeping with the community's aesthetic harmony. Our instructions are simply to process the violation. But the instructions are based on a faulty premise. Grant pressed, the HOA doesn't have the authority to regulate personal items on a private lot. If you wish to dispute the violation, you'll need to do so in writing to the board, Brenda said, already sounding bored. Or you can attend the next open session of the monthly board meeting and voice your concerns during the homeowner forum. She gave him the date and time, clearly eager to end the call. He had been effectively stonewalled, redirected into another formal, controlled process where Lydia held all the power. The monthly board meeting was the following Wednesday, October 18th. Grant signed up for a 3-minute slot during the homeowner forum. He prepared his remarks carefully, bringing a copy of his property's plat map and the relevant section of the CC&Rs. He wouldn't be emotional. He would be factual, direct, and respectful. When his turn came, he walked to the podium at the front of the clubhouse meeting room. Lydia sat at the center of the board table, flanked by the 4 other directors, looking every bit the composed executive. "Good evening," Grant began. "My name is Grant Reed. From 128 Shoreline Drive, I'm here to address the courtesy notice of violation I received regarding my dock. I believe this notice was issued in error, based on a misinterpretation of CC&R Section 8.4.2. He calmly laid out his case, just as he had with Brenda. He explained the distinction between private property and common areas. He held up the plat map, pointing to the clearly marked property lines that extended from the shore out into the lake, encompassing his dock entirely. The rule about aesthetic harmony is intended to apply to structures in common areas, or perhaps the exterior facades of our homes. It is not, and has never been, a license for the ACC to dictate how residents use their own private backyard amenities. A tackle box and a chair do not constitute a violation of any reasonable community standard. He finished with 30 seconds to spare. He had been clear, logical, and had cited the governing documents. He looked at the board, expecting a discussion, perhaps a motion to review the notice. Instead, Lydia offered him another of her thin, brittle smiles. "Thank you for your comments, Mr. Reed. We appreciate you bringing your perspective to the board." She then looked at the HOA's secretary. "Please note for the record that Mr. Reed has voiced his concerns regarding the violation notice for 128 Shoreline Drive." And then, she moved on. "The next item on our agenda is the quarterly landscaping report." Grant stood at the podium, stunned. "Excuse me," he said, trying not to raise his voice. "Are we not going to discuss this? I've presented clear evidence that the violation is invalid." Lydia turned her gaze on him, her expression one of mild annoyance, as if he were a toddler throwing a tantrum. "Mr. Reed, this is the homeowner forum, a time for residents to voice comments. It is not a formal hearing or a debate. The board has heard your position, and it has been entered into the minutes. We will take it under advisement. Now, if you don't mind, we have a schedule to keep." She had used parliamentary procedure like a weapon. By framing his presentation as mere comment, she had completely bypassed the need to engage with his evidence. She made him look like an angry, unreasonable homeowner who didn't understand the rules of the meeting. Several other board members shifted uncomfortably, but none of them challenged her. Grant walked back to his seat, his face burning with a fresh wave of controlled fury. He had played by the rules, and Lydia had expertly used those same rules to shut him down and publicly dismiss him. The very next day, a second certified letter arrived. This one was titled Formal Violation Notice. The courtesy period was over. The letter cited his failure to comply with the initial notice and formally levied a fine of $100. It stated that the fine would double every 30 days. The violation remained uncured. His attempt at a reasonable, amicable resolution had failed completely. He had hit his first true obstacle and been soundly defeated. Lydia wasn't just going to fight him. She was going to humiliate him at every turn. The arrival of the $100 fine was a declaration. The polite phase was over. Grant sat in his study, the formal violation notice lying next to the courtesy notice, a paper trail of escalating hostility. He called Sarah. "She fined you," his sister stated, her voice tight, "after you presented evidence at a public meeting. That's not just aggressive, it's punitive. She's trying to make an example of you." "So what do I do?" Grant asked, feeling a weariness settle deep in his bones. "I feel like I'm in a game where she keeps changing the rules." "You stop playing her game and start playing ours," Sarah said, her lawyer mode fully engaged. "You can't win by being polite or hoping for fairness. You win with facts they can't dismiss and pressure they can't ignore. It's time to stop defending and start investigating." That conversation lit a fire in him. Grant realized he had been too passive, too reliant on the assumption that logic and reason would prevail. He had to prove, unequivocally and publicly, that the HOA had no legal claim. His first move was to call Art Miller. Art was a retired county surveyor in his late 70s, a crusty, brilliant old friend of his father's. He was a man who believed that the truth of a place wasn't in its present appearance, but in the layered history of its deeds, maps, and legal descriptions. He delighted in uncovering what he called the story the land tells. Grant met him for coffee, spreading the violation notices and his plat map on the small table. Art squinted at the documents through his thick glasses, a faint, cynical smile playing on his lips. "Aesthetic harmony," Art grunted, tapping the notice. "That's lawyer speak for whatever I don't like today." Classic overreach. They're trying to claim jurisdiction through a line-of-sight argument. It's flimsy, but it can be a real headache if you don't have your paperwork nailed down. For the next week, Grant and Art became historical detectives. They spent hours at the county recorder's office, the air thick with the smell of old paper and binding glue. Art taught Grant how to navigate the archives, pulling the original vellum plat maps for the entire Lakeside Estate subdivision, filed back in 1982. There, in faded ink, was the surveyor's seal and the unambiguous property lines. Grant's lot, number 14, clearly included a rectangular section of the lakebed extending 50 feet from the high water mark. "There it is," Art said, running a gnarled finger over the line. "Riparian rights. Your father bought the land under the water. The dock isn't just on your property. The land it's anchored to is your property. End of story." Next, they searched for any easements. An easement would be a separate, recorded document granting the HOA specific rights, like the right to regulate aesthetics, over a portion of his private property. They combed through decades of records. They found utility easements for power lines and a drainage easement at the far end of the development. But there was nothing, not a single recorded document, that gave the HOA any control over the lakefront lots. The HOA's claim was not just flimsy. It was a complete fabrication. While Art handled the property records, Sarah guided Grant through the legal process. "Request a formal hearing," she advised. "You're required to under the bylaws if you want to contest the fine. It forces them to create a formal record of the dispute. We want them on record, in writing, defending their position." She also had him submit a formal records request to the HOA for all board meeting minutes from the past year. "We need to see what they've been discussing in their closed-door executive sessions," she explained. "Look for any mention of a waterfront harmonization plan or Viridian Lakescapes." "Who is Viridian Lakescapes?" Grant asked. They're one of the vendors Lydia recommended in the ACC meeting. Remember, a very high-end landscaping and hardscaping company. I did a quick business search. Let's just call it a hunch. A week later, a thick packet arrived from Summit Property Management. It contained the minutes Grant had requested. He spread them out on his dining room table and began to read. Most of it was mundane discussions about sprinkler repairs and delinquent dues. But then he found it. The minutes for the March 4th executive session. A large section, nearly half a page long, was blacked out with a thick marker. Beside it was a typed note, redacted pending vendor contract negotiation. His heart beat a little faster. This was it. Something they didn't want the homeowners to see. He scanned the unredacted text around it. There were mentions of a waterfront initiative and a preliminary budget allocation for common area aesthetic upgrades. Grant was no longer just defending his property. He was on the offensive, uncovering the rot at the core of Lydia's administration. He had the plat map proving his ownership, the lack of an easement proving the HOA had no jurisdiction, and now, heavily redacted minutes that proved they were hiding something. He felt the balance of power begin to shift, ever so slightly, in his favor. The investigation was bearing fruit. He was no longer just the victim of Lydia's campaign. He was the one building a case against her. The redacted minutes were a locked door. Grant knew the key to his entire fight was behind that black ink. But the HOA held it tight. He sent a formal email to the board, politely requesting an unredacted version, citing his rights as a homeowner under the state's Common Interest Development Act. Lydia's reply, sent via the property manager, was swift and dismissive. The redactions were necessary, she claimed, to protect the association's negotiating position with a potential vendor, and were legally protected under business privacy exemptions. It was another dead end, another wall of procedure. This was where Art Miller's decades of local knowledge became invaluable. Summit Property Management, he mused, looking at the letterhead. Their head of operations is a woman named Diane Finch. I did a survey for her brother's property out in the valley a few years back. Decent people. Diane's been in this business for 30 years. She's seen every dirty trick in the book. She has no love for power-tripping board presidents who expose the management company to liability. Art made a call. He didn't threaten or demand. He just talked, surveyor to a surveyor's sister, about old maps and the importance of clear boundaries, both on land and in business. He mentioned the lakeside estate situation, the fabricated easement claim, the punitive fines. He didn't ask for anything specific. He just painted a picture of a board president going rogue and a management company caught in the middle. 2 days later, on November 1st, an anonymous, plain brown envelope appeared in Grant's mailbox. There was no return address. Inside was a single piece of paper, a clean, unredacted copy of the March 4th executive session minutes. Grant's hands trembled slightly as he read the text that had been hidden from him. It was worse than he could have imagined. L. Hart presented a proposal from Viridian Lakescapes for a comprehensive, multi-phase, waterfront initiative. Phase Y involves the mandated replacement of all non-conforming wooden docks with approved composite materials. Viridian has offered the association a 15% commission on all resident contracts referred through the HOA's Preferred Vendor Program. This commission, projected to be between $40,000 and $60,000, will be paid directly to the association to fund common area beautification projects. There it was, a kickback scheme. Lydia wasn't just trying to enforce an aesthetic. She was trying to force dozens of homeowners into expensive, unnecessary construction projects to generate a massive commission for the HOA, which she alone controlled. His dock was just the first domino she needed to fall to set the precedent. But the next paragraph was the true bombshell. Further discussion was held regarding Viridian's contingency. Their proposal and the associated commission are contingent upon the HOA securing aesthetic control and access rights to the waterfront areas of all lake-adjacent lots. L. Hart advised the board that she is confident this can be achieved through a strict interpretation of CC&R for 8.4.2 and, if necessary, the assertion of a prescriptive easement based on historical community use of the walking path. It was a conspiracy, documented in their own minutes. Lydia wasn't just misinterpreting the rules. She was actively plotting to seize regulatory control of private property for financial gain. Her motive wasn't just revenge. It was profit. Cold, hard, calculated greed wrapped in the flag of community beautification. And then, Grant saw the detail that made his blood run cold. The proposal from Viridian Lakescapes had been submitted by its CEO, a man named Marcus Thorne. A quick search of public records revealed that Marcus Thorne was Lydia Hart's brother-in-law. This wasn't just a kickback. It was a self-dealing family enterprise. This changed everything. Grant now understood the ferocity of her attacks, the public humiliation, the fabricated violations. She wasn't just trying to win a dispute. She was trying to bully him into submission to protect a secret, lucrative, and deeply corrupt scheme. He had the truth. He had the unredacted proof. The game had been about his property. Now, it was about exposing a fraud that implicated the entire HOA board. He looked at the sheet of paper, the anonymous gift that had blown the case wide open. Lydia thought she was in control, escalating her petty war against him. She had no idea he was now holding a weapon that could destroy her entire reign. Armed with the unredacted minutes, Grant felt a surge of confidence. He believed the fight was all but over. He drafted a calm, factual letter to the entire board of directors, attaching copies of the plat map, the county record showing no easement, and the explosive minutes. He explained the conflict of interest and the fraudulent nature of the waterfront initiative, and formally requested they rescind the violation notice and drop the matter entirely. He thought the evidence was so overwhelming they would have no choice but to retreat. He was wrong. He had underestimated Lydia's audacity. She didn't retreat. She escalated. On November 8th, another certified letter arrived. It was a notice of hearing. The board had rejected his evidence package and was summoning him to a formal disciplinary hearing to rule on his ongoing violations. The hearing was scheduled for November 20th, just 2 days before the big annual homeowners meeting. The timing was deliberate, designed to publicly brand him as a delinquent resident right before the entire community gathered. The notice also informed him that the proposed fine had now escalated to $250 plus administrative fees. Lydia, sensing that Grant was digging for information, had decided to shift the battleground from a private dispute to a public shaming. She launched a whisper campaign. It started subtly. A post on the official Lakeside Estates community Facebook group from Lydia herself. Exciting news it began. The board is finalizing a visionary waterfront harmonization plan that will significantly enhance our shared natural assets and boost property values for everyone. We're working to create a beautiful, cohesive look for our entire shoreline. Unfortunately, a single homeowner's refusal to comply with community standards is holding up this wonderful project. We urge everyone to encourage community-first thinking. She never used his name, but everyone knew who she meant. The whispers followed him on his walks around the neighborhood. Neighbors who used to wave now offered tight, hesitant smiles, or averted their eyes. He overheard snippets of conversation at the community mailboxes. Heard he's being incredibly difficult. Something about his old dock being a safety hazard. Lydia said he's threatening to sue the HOA, which means our dues will go up to pay for the lawyers. She was poisoning the well. expertly painting him as a selfish obstructionist who was going to cost everyone money. He was no longer Grant Reed, the quiet conservationist. He was the problem homeowner who was blocking progress and threatening the neighborhood's financial health. The social pressure was immense, a suffocating blanket of quiet disapproval. The most painful cut came from his next-door neighbor, Tom, who stopped him while he was bringing in his recycling bins. "Hey, Grant," Tom began, shuffling his feet awkwardly. "Listen, I don't want to get in the middle of anything, but what's this? I hear about you blocking the new lakefront plan." The wife saw a design sketch Lydia posted. Looked pretty nice. Raised property values, you know. Grant tried to explain the reality, the property rights, the kickback scheme, but Tom's eyes glazed over. "Sounds complicated," he said, already backing away. "I just think, for the good of the neighborhood, sometimes you gotta go with the flow." Grant felt profoundly isolated. The facts didn't seem to matter. Lydia was controlling the narrative, and her story, a simple tale of community progress versus one man's selfish stubbornness, was far easier to digest than his complex explanation of property law and corporate malfeasance. The final piece of her campaign was directed at the most vulnerable. He saw Carol, the elderly widow who lived on a fixed income, scrubbing at her mailbox post one afternoon. She looked distressed. "What's wrong, Carol?" he asked gently. She looked up, her eyes welling with tears. "I got another notice. A formal one. With a fine. Lydia says my garden gnome is an unapproved lawn ornament." A gnome. "Grant, my grandchildren gave it to me. They're threatening me with a lien on my house if I don't pay the $100 fine." Lydia was creating another victim, a pawn to use against him. Now. Not only was he the man blocking progress, he was also the reason the HOA was cracking down on everyone else. The message was clear. Grant's defiance is making life difficult for all of us, even sweet, harmless Carol. He was socially isolated, publicly vilified, and facing a formal hearing that he knew would be a kangaroo court. This was Lydia's second major assault, and it was far more insidious than the first. She wasn't just attacking his property anymore. She was attacking his reputation, his relationships, and his standing in the community he loved. The hearing was in less than 2 weeks, and, for the first time, Grant felt a cold sliver of doubt. Maybe they couldn't beat her. The evening of the HOA annual meeting on November 22nd was cold and clear. The clubhouse was packed, with more than 100 homeowners squeezed into rows of chairs. An unusual energy crackled in the room, a mix of routine neighborhood politics and the palpable tension Lydia's campaign had stirred up. At the front of the room, a large projector screen displayed the meeting agenda. Next to it, a bright red digital clock was prominently displayed, set to 5:00. Grant's hearing 2 nights prior had been exactly the sham he'd expected. Lydia and the board had listened to his evidence with polite disinterest before voting unanimously to find him guilty, imposing the fine and warning him that a lien would be placed on his property if it went unpaid. It was a procedural checkmate, designed to discredit him completely before this, the main event. His name was on the agenda for the open forum, where any homeowner could speak. As per a new rule Lydia had instituted to ensure meeting efficiency, speakers were limited to a strict 5 minutes. The large, red clock was her tool of control. When his turn came, a hush fell over the room. Grant walked calmly to the podium, carrying a slim laptop and a USB drive. He placed the laptop on the lectern and connected it to the projector, replacing the agenda with his own presentation. He looked at Lydia, who gave him a small, triumphant smile. She thought she had already won. He took a deep breath and addressed the crowd. "Good evening, everyone. My name is Grant Reed. You've heard a lot about me lately. You've heard that I'm standing in the way of a project that will raise your property values. You've heard that I'm being difficult. Tonight, in the 5 minutes I have, I'm here to show you the truth." He nodded to Sarah, who was sitting in the front row. She discreetly started a timer on her phone and hit the start button on the digital clock. The numbers began to tick down, 4:59, 4:58. Minute 1. The CC&Rs. Grant's first slide showed the full text of CC&R 408.4.2. This is the rule I am accused of violating. It says structures visible from common areas must maintain aesthetic harmony, as determined by the ACC. For weeks, our board president has used that last phrase, "as determined by the ACC," to claim they have unlimited power to regulate anything they can see. But that phrase doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's limited by property law and by the rest of our governing documents. The clock ticked past 4:00. Minute 2. The plat map. He clicked to the next slide. A high-resolution image of the official, recorded county plat map filled the screen. He used a laser pointer to trace the boundaries of his property. This is not my opinion. This is a legal fact recorded at the county courthouse. My property line, like that of every lakefront owner here, extends 50 feet into the lake. My dock is not near a common area. It is squarely, legally, and undeniably on my private lot. The HOA has as much authority to regulate what's on my dock as they do to regulate the color of the curtains in my living room. A surprised murmur rippled through the audience. Many had never seen the actual map. The clock showed 3:05. Minute 3. The minutes. So why, Grant asked, his voice even? Why invent a violation where none exists? I formally requested the minutes from the board's March 4th executive session to understand their reasoning. The next slide showed the redacted document he had received. This is what they gave me. A crucial section blacked out, hiding a pending vendor contract negotiation. He paused, letting the image sink in. Then he clicked again. The unredacted version appeared on screen, the damning paragraphs highlighted in yellow. And this is the truth they didn't want you to see. The clock hit 2:10. He read the text aloud, the 15% commission, the contingency on seizing control of private property, and the name of the company, Viridian Lakescapes, owned by Lydia's brother-in-law. Gasps filled the room. The whispers were no longer about Grant. They were about Lydia. He could see the color draining from her face. Minute 4. The moral twist, before he could continue. Lydia stood up, her voice sharp and commanding. This is a complete mischaracterization of a confidential board discussion. Mr. Reed has obtained these documents improperly, and he is twisting them to avoid his own responsibilities. She turned to Grant, her eyes blazing, but her voice dropped to a conspiratorial, almost pleading tone, meant only for him and those nearby. Grant, stop this now. Let's be reasonable. We can make this all go away. I will personally move to waive all your fines. Just drop it, in return for your cooperation. All we ask is your support for a minor enforcement action, say, for Mrs. Peterson's garden gnome. It gives the board a procedural win, shows the rules are being enforced, and you walk away clean. The clock showed 1:15. The room was dead silent. Everyone had heard her. She was offering him a deal, his freedom, in exchange for the public sacrifice of his innocent, elderly neighbor. It was a test, a final, desperate gambit to prove he was as selfish as she had claimed. Grant looked from Lydia's panicked face to Carol Peterson, who was watching him, her expression a mixture of fear and hope. He turned back to the microphone, his voice ringing with newfound strength. "No," he said, clearly and firmly. I will not participate in a system that bullies an elderly woman over her garden gnome to cover up a fraud. The rules of this community must apply fairly to everyone, or they are meaningless. My fine is not the issue. The issue is the abuse of power, the self-dealing, and the attempt to strip homeowners of their property rights for personal profit. He had 30 seconds left. This is not about a dock. It's about the integrity of our community. I am not the one in violation here. He looked directly at Lydia, then at the other board members. Therefore, I use my remaining time to formally call for a vote of no confidence in President Hart and this entire board of directors. And I move for an immediate, independent, forensic audit of this association's finances for the last 3 years. The clock hit 000. The room exploded. The eruption in the clubhouse was instantaneous and chaotic. Dozens of homeowners were on their feet, shouting questions and demanding answers. The carefully controlled order of Lydia's meeting had shattered into a million pieces. A kickback scheme. Is it true about your brother-in-law? Lydia. What about my fine for my basketball hoop? Through the din, the first clear voice of support rang out. It was Tom, Grant's next-door neighbor, the one who had told him to go with the flow. He stood up, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. I second the motion, he yelled. I second the motion for a vote of no confidence and a full audit. That broke the dam. A chorus of seconded echoed through the room. The property manager, Brenda, who had been sitting quietly at a side table, saw the impending legal disaster. Her company's name was tied to the violation notices and the stonewalling. She immediately stood and moved to the podium, taking the microphone from Grant. On behalf of Summit Property Management, she announced, her voice strained but firm, I want to state for the record that we act solely at the direction of the board. We were not privy to the vendor negotiations or the unredacted contents of the executive session minutes. In light of this new information, we will be recommending to the board that they seek independent legal counsel immediately. It was a textbook corporate maneuver to distance the company from a client who had just become radioactive. She was throwing Lydia to the wolves to save herself. Lydia stood frozen behind the board table, her face a pale mask of shock. The other board members, who had been her silent allies, now looked at her as if she were a stranger. One of them, a mild-mannered man named George, cleared his throat. Lydia, I think we need to address this. We were told the redactions were standard procedure. He was already creating his own defense, laying the blame squarely at her feet. Sarah, ever the lawyer, stepped forward. According to the bylaws, a motion for a vote of no confidence, once seconded by 3 homeowners, requires an immediate special vote. Furthermore, a motion for an independent audit requires a simple majority vote of the members present. Homeowners swarmed the sign-in sheet at the entrance, verifying their eligibility to vote. Ballots were hastily written on scraps of paper. The result was a landslide. The vote of no confidence in Lydia Hart passed 104-3. The motion for a forensic audit passed unanimously. Lydia watched, powerless, as her authority evaporated in a matter of minutes. The meticulous structure of control she had built over years had been dismantled by 5 minutes of irrefutable truth. She gathered her leather portfolio, her movements stiff and robotic, and walked out of the clubhouse without a word, the hostile glares of her former subjects following her every step. She was utterly alone, an emperor with no clothes. Her reign over Lakeside Estates finished. In the aftermath, an ad hoc committee was formed on the spot, led by Grant, Carol, and Tom, to oversee the transition. They scheduled a special election for a new board. The atmosphere in the room had transformed from tension and anger to a giddy sense of liberation and purpose. Neighbors were talking to each other, comparing stories of bogus fines and intimidation. No longer isolated victims, but a unified front. Grant stood near the back of the room, watching the community begin to heal itself. Sarah came up beside him and squeezed his arm. "You did it," she whispered. "You didn't just save your dock. You saved the whole neighborhood." He looked out the window at the dark, placid water of the lake, his father's lake. The fight had been long and exhausting, but standing there, surrounded by a community he had inadvertently galvanized, he felt a profound sense of peace. The battle was over. The hard work of rebuilding was just beginning. The weeks that followed the annual meeting were a whirlwind of methodical change. A new, transparent board of directors was elected, with Carol Peterson unanimously voted in as treasurer and Tom as the new head of the ACC. Grant politely declined a board seat, preferring his role as an informal advisor and watchdog. The independent audit confirmed Grant's findings and uncovered the full extent of Lydia's financial malfeasance. The fraud was deeper than just the Viridian Lakescape scheme. It included padded invoices from a dozen shell companies, all linked back to Lydia or her relatives. The final report was a damning indictment of systematic corruption. With the audit complete, the new board voted to turn the entire evidence file over to the county's district attorney. The matter moved from a civil dispute to a criminal investigation. Lydia Hart and her brother-in-law were eventually indicted on charges of fraud, conspiracy, and embezzlement. With the legal machinery handling the perpetrators, the community turned its focus inward. The new board, with Grant's help, undertook a complete overhaul of the CC&Rs. They clarified the ambiguous language, strictly defined the boundaries between private lots and common areas, and established a clear, fair, and transparent process for violations and hearings. The era of aesthetic harmony as a weapon was over. Months passed. Spring arrived, breathing new life into the budding trees around the lake. The water was clear and healthy, the ecosystem slowly recovering. One warm Saturday afternoon in May, Grant was finally doing what he had set out to do all those months ago. He was on his dock, a can of natural redwood stain beside him, carefully applying a fresh, protective coat to the weathered cedar planks. The wood drank in the oil, its rich color returning, looking as strong and beautiful as the day his father had laid the final board. Later that day, at the first annual Lakeside Estates Community Picnic, an event organized by the new board to foster goodwill, Grant stood up to make a small announcement. "When my father built our home here," he began, his voice carrying over the happy chatter, "he didn't see the lake as something to own, but as something to be cherished. This past year, we all fought a difficult battle over what it means to be a community and what the boundaries are between us. We fought to protect our individual rights, and we won." He paused, looking around at the faces of his neighbors, people who were no longer strangers, but allies. "In the spirit of being a true community, and in honor of my father's love for this lake, I've had my sister, Sarah, draw up a formal, legal document. I am granting a formal, limited easement on the small, northwest corner of my property for the creation of a shared community, kayak and canoe launch. It will be owned and managed by the association, with clear rules to protect the shoreline and the wildlife, so that every family here can have a safe and respectful way to enjoy the water my father loved so much." A stunned silence fell over the crowd, followed by a wave of heartfelt applause. It was an act of profound generosity, a gesture that proved his fight had never been about selfishly hoarding his property. It had been about principle, by giving a small piece of his land back to the community on his own terms. Legally and safely, he was restoring the very harmony Lydia had used as a pretense for her corruption. He was honoring his father's legacy not by walling it off, but by sharing it responsibly. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow across the water, Grant watched his own son showing Tom's daughter how to skip a stone across the surface from the edge of the newly stained dock. He had fought for his property, defended his father's memory, and in doing so, had helped his neighbors reclaim their community. The lake was quiet, peaceful, and for the first time in a very long time, it truly belonged to everyone.